Welcome back to Midnight Whispers. Don't forget to subscribe, turn off the lights, and let's step into something you can't unhear. She says she first noticed the strange thing in her room on a night so ordinary, it hurts to remember how easily it all could have been ignored. A moment when she walked in after a long day and felt the air shift as if the walls were holding their breath around her. She remembers dropping her bag, glancing toward the corner near her dresser, and freezing because there, low to the floor, was a tiny wooden door that absolutely hadn't been there the day before. And the shock hit her like an icy hand closing slowly around her spine. She stepped closer, convinced her eyes were playing a trick on her. But the closer she got, the more real the door became. Old, chipped, beige paint, a tiny brass knob, and a faint smell of damp earth rising from its seams like something breathing behind it. She ran her fingers over the edges, feeling how unnaturally smooth the wood was, polished in a way the rest of her room had never been, as if it belonged to another place entirely, and had somehow slipped into her world without asking permission. She remembers whispering to herself that she must have forgotten something from childhood, like a memory misfiled. But she knew every inch of that room because she had lived her entire adolescence inside it. And there had never been any secret opening, no decorative panels, nothing but plain drywall. She crouched down, listening, trying to convince herself that silence meant safety. Yet the quiet behind that door felt tense, purposeful, like whatever was on the other side was aware of her arrival and waiting for her next move with unsettling patience. She tried to walk away, telling herself it was late, that she was tired, that she'd deal with it in the morning. But something about turning her back felt dangerous, like she'd expose a part of herself that shouldn't be left vulnerable in the presence of something so unknown. She stood still, holding her breath, fighting the instinct to flee, and felt a creeping sensation that the door was somehow leaning toward her, even though it hadn't moved, as if space itself was shifting around it like ripples around a foreign object dropped into calm water. She grabbed her phone, snapped a picture, and stared at the screen because the door looked even more wrong in the image. Edges warped, colors distorted, as if the camera recognized something her eyes weren't ready to accept. She thought about calling someone, maybe a friend, maybe her mom, anyone who could tell her that what she was seeing made sense. But some instinct deep in her gut warned her that speaking about it out loud might make it more real, might invite something she wasn't prepared to face. She reached toward the knob, her hand trembling, not because she wanted to open it, but because she needed to know if it was solid, or if she could push her hand right through it like a dream. And the cold metal that met her touch sent a shiver that went straight to her bones. She jerked her hand back, heart racing, because the knob was warm now, impossibly warm, like something on the other side had placed its hand exactly where hers had been a moment earlier. She didn't scream, though she wanted to. Instead, she backed away slowly, keeping her eyes locked on the door as she reached for the light switch, flicking it on and off, desperate to see if the change in lighting would make the door vanish. She turned the lights off again, hoping darkness would swallow the impossible thing. But the door glowed faintly in the dim room, as if it had its own source of light, a soft pulsation that made her stomach twist. She approached it one more time, her breath shaky, and whispered to herself that she was dreaming. Yet she knew deep down it was no dream, because dreams didn't smell like old dirt and wet wood, and something faintly metallic hidden beneath it. She pressed her ear against it again, listening harder than she ever had in her life. And for the first time, she heard a faint scraping sound from the other side, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across stone. She stumbled backward, hitting the dresser behind her, and the sound stopped instantly, not fading, not tapering off, just stopping, as though whatever had been moving sensed her fear and froze in place. She stared at the door, her breath catching in her throat, and felt a certainty settle inside her that something behind that wood had been waiting for her specifically, not by accident, not by coincidence, but by purpose. She backed toward her bed, collapsing into the sheets, refusing to blink in case the door changed shape or opened when she wasn't looking. And the tension in the room felt so thick it pressed against her chest with every breath. She thought about leaving the room entirely, escaping into the hallway. But something told her that if she left, the door might not stay where it was. It might appear somewhere else, closer, or somewhere she couldn't avoid. She stayed awake for hours, staring, refusing to look away even when her eyes burned and blurred. Because the idea of sleeping, while something unknown had access to her space, filled her with a dread unlike anything she had ever known. She tried distracting herself with her phone, scrolling endlessly, but her eyes kept drifting back to the door, drawn as if by a magnet she couldn't fight, as though the door was pulling at her thoughts. She whispered to herself that morning would fix everything, that daylight would dissolve this nightmare, and that she could laugh about it someday. But the room didn't feel like it would ever belong to morning again. She checked the clock, realized only 15 minutes had passed since she first saw the door, though it felt like hours, as if time itself was stretching thin around her. She wondered if anyone else had ever found something in their home that wasn't supposed to exist, something inserted into reality without permission, something that made the familiar suddenly dangerous. She hugged her knees to her chest, watching the faint glow pulse, steady and slow, like a heartbeat on the other side. And she tried not to think about the possibility that it was exactly that, a heartbeat. She told herself to breathe, to stay grounded, to stay rational. But every instinct screamed that rationality had already left the room the moment she saw that small, impossible door. She flinched when the scraping sound returned, softer this time, almost curious, and the slow drag of it played across her nerves like a cold fingertip tracing her spine. She pressed a hand over her mouth to keep from gasping, her heart pounding so hard she wondered if whatever was behind the door could hear it, could track her fear like a scent. She sat there unmoving, listening, terrified, knowing that whatever this was, whatever had appeared in her room, was not going to go away on its own. She woke the next morning with her neck stiff and her back aching, realizing she had fallen asleep sitting up. And when her eyes finally adjusted to the pale light leaking through the curtains, the tiny door was still there, unchanged, yet somehow feeling even more wrong than the night before. She stood slowly, expecting dizziness, but the room felt heavier than usual, as if the air carried weight, pressing down on her lungs with every breath she dragged in. She stared at the small door, noticing details she could have sworn weren't there last night, like new scratches around the frame, and a faint dark streak beneath the hinge that looked disturbingly like dried soil smeared by something being dragged. She moved closer, her steps cautious, telling herself she just needed to understand what she was dealing with. But every inch she approached made her skin prickle with a cold that didn't match the warmth of the room. She crouched in front of it again and felt the same unnatural warmth radiating from the knob, stronger now, almost like someone or something was just on the other side, standing inches away from her. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady, and called out softly, even though she wasn't sure why she expected an answer, hoping maybe the absurdity of the situation would break if she acknowledged it out loud. She waited in silence, hearing only her own heartbeat echo inside her ears, and the stillness made her skin crawl because silence didn't feel like quiet, it felt like listening. She reached out with one trembling finger and touched the wood, feeling a slight vibration, so faint she almost doubted it, but unmistakably alive in the way a heartbeat is alive, rhythmic and pulsing beneath the surface. She snatched her hand back instantly, breath catching, because she knew without question that the door wasn't just an object. It was connected to something, fused into something that had no business being in her world. She stood and backed away until her calves hit the edge of her bed, needing distance, needing space. But the room felt smaller than ever, as though the geometry of it had subtly changed around the presence of the unfamiliar opening. She checked her phone again for the photograph she took last night and felt a chill run through her because the picture was different now, the door appearing slightly open in the image, even though in reality it remained shut. She blinked hard, refreshed the photo, zoomed in, but the picture remained the same, gaping slightly, revealing only darkness inside. And she felt a nausea rise in her throat, thinking the image had captured a moment she hadn't seen with her own eyes. She debated deleting the photo, thinking maybe erasing it would break whatever strange connection she felt. But her hand froze because deleting it felt like erasing proof that she wasn't losing her mind. She walked to her bedroom door to leave, intent on calling someone, maybe telling a story she'd regret confessing. But when she opened the door to the hallway, she hesitated because the hallway looked subtly unfamiliar, as though the lighting had changed or the walls had been repainted overnight. She stepped into the hallway and immediately felt the temperature drop sharply, a biting cold running across her skin, and she turned back to her room instinctively, drawn to the warmth she had just left. She leaned against the doorway, overwhelmed, realizing her room had become both a trap and a refuge, holding the only explanation for the strange events, while simultaneously being the last place she wanted to be. She whispered to herself that she needed to stay calm, to ground herself in rational thought. But rationality had already failed her the moment she realized the house around her no longer felt like the one she had grown up in. She forced herself down the hall, each step echoing in a way the house had never echoed before, hollow and stretched, as though the sound traveled farther than it should. She reached the kitchen and stopped abruptly because she swore the chairs were placed differently. The shadows cast in directions she didn't remember, and the faint smell of damp earth followed her, even here. She leaned against the counter, running her hands over the cool surface, trying to convince herself the world was still intact, still real. But her mind churned with the memory of that pulsing warmth from the door. She opened a drawer, pulled out a flashlight she kept for storms, and decided she needed to know what was behind that door, because ignorance felt more dangerous than truth at this point. She returned to her room slowly, dread growing with each step. And when she saw the tiny door again, it looked more centered on the wall than before, like it had subtly shifted position to meet her halfway. She didn't want to kneel down, didn't want to get close, but the need to understand outweighed her fear, and she lowered herself cautiously, flashlight trembling in her hand. She brought the light close to the wood, pressing the beam against its seams, and gasped softly because the grain of the wood wasn't normal. It shifted under the light like moving fibers, as though the surface breathed. She quickly pulled the flashlight back, chest tight, suddenly realizing she wasn't examining an object, but observing a living boundary between her world and something else entirely. She reached for the knob again, her hand shaking uncontrollably, knowing the decision she was about to make could alter her life forever. But the dread of not knowing had begun to eclipse the dread of knowing. She pressed down on the brass knob, feeling it twist smoothly, almost eagerly, and the faint click of the latch disengaging echoed far louder than it should have in such a small room. She hesitated with the door cracked open the tiniest fraction, cold air rushing out like a breath from another world, and she felt her stomach sink with the certainty that nothing good waited behind it. She slowly pushed it open wider, heart pounding so violently she felt lightheaded, and the darkness that unfolded before her seemed endless, thick, and impossibly deep. She lifted the flashlight and shined it inside, expecting to see a cramped crawl space. But instead, she saw something that made her breath stop entirely. Her mind unable to process how such a space could exist behind a wall that should have been only 6 inches thick. She stared into the opening, unable to comprehend how the small door led to a space that stretched far beyond the physical limits of her home. An almost cavernous corridor lined with rough stone walls that receded into darkness without any visible end. She felt a cold draft roll out from the passageway, carrying a damp, metallic scent that clung to her lungs and made the small hairs along her arms stand upright with primal warning. She stepped closer, leaning her head just past the frame, and the air around her shifted in temperature so drastically that she shivered, teeth nearly chattering despite the warmth of her room behind her. She hesitated, knowing she should walk away, close the door, pretend none of this was happening. But her curiosity had dug its claws into her mind, whispering that the truth was buried somewhere inside that impossible corridor. She pressed the flashlight beam deeper, scanning the uneven walls, and noticed faint carvings etched into the stone like symbols she didn't recognize. Worn by time, yet feeling disturbingly intentional. She leaned further in, trying to decipher the shapes. But the symbols seemed to shift subtly when she looked away, rearranging themselves like living things adapting to her gaze. She jerked back instinctively, heart pounding, realizing the carvings were not static decoration, but something that responded to her presence, as though the walls themselves were aware of being observed. She lowered the flashlight to the dirt floor, noticing strange tracks, small, uneven impressions that almost resembled footsteps, but not quite, as though something walked upright but dragged parts of itself along the ground. She swallowed hard, imagining creatures she had never seen and hoped she would never encounter. And the thought of any living thing navigating that narrow passage made her stomach twist with fear. She turned her head slightly, listening for movement, and heard a faint echo deep inside the corridor, a soft, rhythmic sound that didn't match her own breathing and made the hair at the nape of her neck rise. She froze, her whole body tightening, and tried to convince herself it was just water dripping somewhere in the unseen depths. But the cadence was too steady, too measured, almost as if something was pacing slowly. She considered calling for help again, but knew how insane she would sound trying to explain that a doorway in her bedroom had opened into a stone passage that didn't belong to any architectural logic. She took a half step closer, peering down the corridor with wide, fearful eyes, and noticed the darkness seemed to retreat from the flashlight beam with a sluggish reluctance, almost as if the shadows themselves were alive and avoiding the light. She felt her breathing quicken, chest tightening, and forced herself to take another deep breath as she scanned the floor again, noticing new prints appearing in the dust as she watched, as though something unseen was approaching slowly. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream as she realized the prints were forming in real time, one after another, drawing closer inch by inch. She scrambled back to her bed, curling against it while never taking her eyes off the corridor, her pulse racing so violently she could hear it thundering inside her ears like a warning drum. She whispered to herself that this couldn't be real, that she was losing her grip on reality. But the sight of those emerging footprints was too vivid, too undeniable to be dismissed as hallucination. She watched as the footsteps reached the edge of the stone threshold, stopping just before the opening, as if whatever made them was standing just out of sight, waiting patiently. She held her breath, frozen, sensing the presence lingering beyond the doorway, its stillness more terrifying than any movement because it suggested intelligence, awareness, and an unsettling curiosity. She clutched the flashlight tighter, her knuckles pale, and adjusted the beam, angling it across the threshold to see if she could catch a glimpse of the creature. But the light revealed nothing but the still forming tracks. She felt a cold ripple pass through her as the room seemed to shrink around her, the edges of her vision dimming slightly as her fear climbed to new heights she didn't know existed. She whispered a trembling plea for the creature to go away, even though she knew it couldn't hear her or chose not to acknowledge her desperation. She backed further away from the tiny door, wishing she could escape the room entirely. But her legs felt weak and unsteady, unable to support her if she tried to run. She wiped tears from her eyes, not remembering when she started crying, and kept her focus locked on the corridor, terrified the creature would finally reveal itself. She watched as the last set of prints completed themselves at the edge, and then nothing else moved, as though whatever was approaching had stopped abruptly upon sensing her retreat. She tried to slow her breathing, whispering shaky reassurances to herself, but her mind spiraled with possibilities of what could create such prints, none of them comforting. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, desperate for distraction or connection. But when she turned it on, the screen flickered with distorted lines and symbols she had never seen before, as though the device couldn't function properly near the open passageway. She dropped the phone onto the bed, startled by the flickering, and felt her dread intensify as she realized the influence of the phenomenon extended beyond the physical, affecting electronics in ways she couldn't explain. She crawled slightly closer to the tiny door, her knees shaking, determined to close it before something forced its way out. But the moment she reached for the knob, a slow scraping sound rose from the corridor, as though warning her not to touch it. She backed away again, breath shallow, because the sound wasn't random, it was responsive, timed perfectly with her movement. And that possibility terrified her more than anything that had happened so far. She remained crouched near the foot of her bed, trembling, gripping her own arms for comfort, as the scraping sound from the corridor continued, steady and deliberate, echoing through the narrow passage like something dragging itself closer. She felt her heartbeat slam against her ribs, each thud painful, as if her own body was warning her of an impending danger she had no way of understanding or escaping. She whispered to herself that she needed to close the door, needed to shut off whatever connection her room now had to this impossible place. But the thought of reaching toward it again made her hands cold and numb with fear. She inched forward slowly, moving on all fours like she was approaching a wounded animal that might lash out at any sudden motion. And the corridor responded with a low growl-like vibration deep within its depths. She froze instantly, unable to breathe for a moment, because the vibration wasn't a sound her ears heard. It was something she felt through the floorboards, a tremor rising through her bones, like a living thing reaching toward her. She forced herself to continue, refusing to surrender to panic, though her entire body screamed at her to flee, to run as far as she could from the small door that had torn open the limits of reality. She reached the edge of the threshold again, her hand trembling so violently she could barely keep her grip on the flashlight. And she aimed the beam downward, terrified of what she might see. She gasped softly when she found the footprints were still there, but now slightly deeper, as though whatever creature had made them had pressed its weight down harder, reacting to her movements with eerie precision. She leaned closer, trying to peer into the darkness without crossing the threshold, and felt a wave of cold air wash over her face, so sharp and sudden it made her eyes water. She blinked through the tears, straining to see further down the corridor. And for a moment, she thought she saw something shift in the darkness, a subtle shift in the shadows, like a figure pulling slightly backward. She jerked upright, stumbling backward, terrified, because she couldn't tell whether the creature was retreating or preparing to lunge forward. And both possibilities sent fear spiraling through her chest. She scrambled onto her bed, curling her legs beneath her, hugging herself tightly as she watched the corridor's edge with unblinking, terrified focus. She wondered if closing her eyes would make it disappear, if the doorway would vanish as suddenly as it appeared last night. But she knew deep down that whatever force had brought it here wasn't governed by her hopes or wishes. She tried to steady her breathing, wiping tears away with shaking hands. But every time the scraping sound echoed again, her body tensed, her heart leaping into her throat. She whispered that she needed to be brave, needed to gather the courage to close the door before something stepped through it entirely. But her limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, paralyzed by adrenaline. She heard the faintest whisper of air shift behind her and spun around in terror, only to find her room unchanged, sunlight filtering softly through the curtains. Utterly at odds with the horror unfolding inches away, she turned back to the small door, the daylight illuminating the edges of the wooden frame, and realized something terrifying. The corridor inside remained as dark as ever, unaffected by the sunlight, as though no light could enter it. She stared at the darkness, swallowing the beam of her flashlight, bending it inward like the passage absorbed whatever touched it. And the idea that the darkness was selective, purposeful, made her stomach churn. She forced herself to inch closer again, even though her instincts screamed against it, because she knew ignoring the doorway wouldn't make it disappear, and leaving it open felt like an invitation she couldn't afford to give. She reached toward the knob once more, her fingers brushing the warm brass, and she nearly yanked her hand away again, because it pulsed faintly beneath her touch, like a living heartbeat responding to her presence. She closed her eyes and twisted the knob slowly, bracing herself for the scraping to intensify. But instead the sound ceased abruptly, leaving a silence so deep it rang in her ears. She began pushing the door shut with trembling hands, terrified of what might happen if she moved too slowly. But the door resisted slightly, as though something on the other side pressed back. She gasped and pushed harder, feeling the frame tremble under her palms. And with one final shove, the door clicked shut, sealing the corridor into darkness once more. She collapsed backward onto the floor, overwhelmed with relief, tears streaming down her face, her breath shaky, but slowly returning to a steady rhythm as she stared at the now closed door. She reached up slowly and touched the wood, half expecting it to pulse or vibrate again. But it was merely warm now, not alive, not breathing, just an eerie reminder of what she had seen. She backed away cautiously, retreating to the far side of the room, not daring to look away, but needing distance, craving the safety of space between her and the impossible doorway. She grabbed her phone from the bed again, relieved to see the screen working normally now, and quickly snapped another picture, praying the image would simply match what she saw with her eyes this time. She looked at the photo and felt a wave of nausea crash over her because the door appeared slightly open in the picture again, a sliver of darkness visible inside, even though it remained physically closed in front of her. She stared at her phone in disbelief, her heartbeat returning to its frantic pace, because she realized the doorway wasn't bound by the rules of her reality, and closing it didn't guarantee it would stay closed. She whispered to herself in a trembling voice that she needed help, needed someone who could understand. But a cold certainty settled in her chest that no one would believe her. And worse, no one could stop what had already begun. She sat frozen on the edge of her bed, the image on her phone burning into her mind as proof that the doorway had intentions of its own, mocking her attempt to shut it out with a photograph that revealed the truth more honestly than her own eyes could. She held the phone at arm's length, staring at the faint sliver of darkness peeking through the captured image, feeling as if the corridor itself was watching her through the screen, studying her reactions, waiting for her next move. She lowered the phone slowly, her breath shallow and unsteady, and turned her gaze back to the door, relieved to see it still physically shut, even though her fear told her the calmness was only temporary. She stood up cautiously, legs trembling beneath her, feeling an overwhelming urge to flee the room entirely, to put as much distance as she could between herself and the impossible opening that had violated the safety of her home. She hurried toward her bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, closing it behind her as though that simple wooden door could shield her from the nightmare lurking behind the smaller one. She pressed her back against the hallway wall, trying to steady her breath, but the air felt stale, strangely unmoving, as if the entire house held itself unnaturally still in response to what she had encountered. She tiptoed down the hall, hyper-aware of every creak beneath her feet, every shift in the air, terrified the small door might reappear somewhere else, under the stairs, behind a cabinet, or worse, outside her own room. She reached the living room and froze when she noticed a faint trail of dirt smeared across the floorboards, a thin, winding line that looked disturbingly similar to the dust marks she had seen inside the hidden corridor. She followed the trail slowly, heart pounding, as she traced the path across the living room rug, then along the baseboards, feeling dread twist her insides, because it suggested something had already wandered into her home. She crouched near the smudged footprints, shining her flashlight over them, and felt cold sweat break across her skin when she realized the marks were too precise, too intentional, curving toward the kitchen as though leading her somewhere. She stood up slowly, wiped her palms on her jeans, and debated turning around, hiding in her room, pretending she hadn't seen the trail. But some part of her knew that ignoring it would only make things worse. She followed the path into the kitchen, where the faint dirt smears climbed unnervingly up the lower cabinets, streaks that looked like something had grasped the wood with wet hands or crawling limbs. She backed away, unable to stop the wave of nausea that rose in her throat, because the evidence suggested the creature hadn't simply stayed behind the corridor. It had explored her home while she slept. She grabbed a broom instinctively, not for cleaning, but as a makeshift weapon, though the logical part of her mind whispered that something capable of creating an endless stone corridor behind a bedroom wall couldn't be stopped by a broom. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, trembling, scanning every corner with frantic eyes, convinced she would see something crouched behind the table or perched in the shadows above the cabinets. She whispered to herself that she needed to leave the house entirely, to get outside where the sunlight might protect her. But another part of her feared bringing the presence with her, feared exposing the world beyond her home to something no one could control. She reached for her coat hanging by the door, hesitated, and stared at the front doorknob with a strange sense of dread, as though the house itself might not let her leave easily. She grabbed the knob and twisted it quickly, expecting resistance, but it turned freely, and she swung the front door open to reveal an ordinary street bathed in sunlight, quiet and unchanged. She stepped outside, breathing fresh air like a drowning person reaching the surface, feeling immediate relief simply from the distance between her and the small door. She stood on the porch, hugging herself as she tried to rationalize everything, grasping for any explanation that didn't involve creatures, portals, or impossible architecture. But her mind came up empty. She considered calling someone, maybe her best friend, maybe even the police. But what would she say? That she found a mysterious door leading to another dimension inside her bedroom. She walked to the edge of her driveway and stared at her house, feeling an unsettling sensation that the structure itself seemed to tilt slightly, not physically, but in a way that felt psychological, as though the house regarded her differently now. She paced in small circles, muttering to herself, reminding herself that she had seen the door appear out of nowhere, seen the corridor's impossible depth, seen footprints form in real time, and denial was no longer an option. She tried to calm her thoughts, focusing on her breathing, but images of the corridor kept flashing through her mind, those shifting symbols, the dragging footsteps, the pulsing warmth of the brass knob. She wondered if the creature had followed her beyond the doorway, if it had truly walked her house, or if the dirt trail had been some kind of illusion meant to lure her into panic. She forced herself to breathe deeply, deciding she needed to confront the doorway again, to find some way to seal it permanently, because leaving it open or unattended felt like abandoning a ticking bomb inside her home. She walked slowly back toward her front door, each step heavier than the last, her dread growing with the realization that she was returning voluntarily to something she knew was far beyond her understanding. She stepped inside again, locking the door behind her, as though that thin barrier could protect her from something that had already bent the laws of her reality. She walked down the hall, flashlight trembling in her hand once more, forcing herself to take slow breaths as she approached her bedroom door with shaky determination. She paused outside her room, pressing her forehead against the wood, listening for any sign of movement inside, hearing only the faint hum of silence that felt unnervingly expectant. She turned the knob slowly, pushed the door open, and stepped inside, tightening her grip on the flashlight as her eyes instantly darted toward the corner where the tiny door remained. She froze in place, breath caught in her throat, because the small door was open again, this time wider than before. And she knew with chilling certainty that the creature inside had been waiting for her return. She stood motionless, staring at the tiny door gaping open in her wall like a hungry mouth. The darkness inside deeper than should be possible, swallowing the light that filtered gently through the window behind her. She felt her breath stutter as she took a step backward, instinctively distancing herself from the gaping void. But no amount of distance inside that room felt safe anymore, especially with the passage open wider than it had ever been. She raised the flashlight, her hand trembling violently, and shined it into the opening. But the beam seemed to evaporate as though absorbed by something dense and living beyond the threshold. She whispered to herself that she needed to stay calm, that panicking wouldn't save her. But her thoughts spiraled uncontrollably as she imagined unseen eyes watching her from the depths of that impossible corridor. She took a shaky breath and moved closer, her entire body tense with fear, trying to see whether the footprints she had witnessed forming earlier had progressed beyond the edge of the stone floor. She crouched down again, heart pounding so hard she could hear it echoing through her chest, and angled the flashlight downward, scanning the threshold for any sign of movement or fresh tracks. She gasped as she found new imprints deeper, clearer, and positioned well past where they had once stopped, confirming that something had stepped fully into her room while she had been outside. She crawled backward on the floor, unable to stand, her limbs shaking uncontrollably as the realization washed over her that the creature was no longer confined to the space behind the small door. She turned her head slowly, scanning her room with wide, fearful eyes, terrified she would see something crouched behind her dresser, lurking in the corner, or perched somewhere just outside her line of sight. She swallowed hard, listening to the silence pressing against her from every side. So thick and unnatural, it felt like the air had congealed around her, trapping her in a soundless cage. She whispered that she needed to leave the house completely, that confronting the creature was not possible. But the thought of running through the hallway with her back exposed filled her with paralyzing dread. She forced herself to take a deep breath, rising unsteadily to her feet, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. As she stepped backward toward the door without turning her back on the corridor, she kept her eyes locked on the small opening, terrified the creature might emerge the moment she blinked. But the darkness remained still, eerily still, like a predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. She reached behind her, fumbling for the bedroom doorknob, fingers slipping from sweat as she desperately tried not to lose sight of the opening on the far wall. She found the knob and twisted it, stepping backward into the hallway, her breath hitching as she tried to move without making a sound, fearing any noise might draw the creature forward. She slowly closed the bedroom door, watching the tiny one shrink from view inch by inch through the narrow opening, until the heavy click of the latch sealed it away once more. She leaned against the hallway wall, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face as adrenaline surged through her veins, her body shaking uncontrollably as the horror of what she had witnessed settled deeper into her bones. She whispered that she needed help, that she couldn't handle this alone. But a cold realization struck her. No one would believe her unless they saw the door, and exposing them to it felt like signing their death sentences. She stumbled toward the living room, gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, terrified the creature had followed her beyond the bedroom. She sank onto the couch, curling into a ball as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. But the image of the footprints kept replaying in her mind, each impression a reminder that something tangible had crossed into her world. She pressed her face into her knees, fighting the urge to scream. But she knew screaming wouldn't save her, wouldn't close the doorway, and wouldn't undo the fact that her home was no longer her own. She wiped her tears and lifted her head slowly, staring at the hallway leading to her room, a cold certainty settling over her that the door would not stay sealed for long, no matter how many times she shut it. She whispered that she had to see it again, that she needed to confirm whether it remained closed, because fear of the unknown creeping through her home was worse than facing the horror head-on. She pushed herself off the couch, legs trembling under her weight, and walked slowly toward the hallway, each step heavier than the last, her breath shallow and uneven as she approached her room. She placed her ear against the bedroom door, listening for movement, for scraping, for anything that indicated the creature still lingered beyond the tiny door inside. But the silence was suffocating. She twisted the doorknob with a shaking hand, opening the door a fraction of an inch, peering inside with eyes wide and unblinking, terrified of what she might find. She held her breath, scanning the room from the doorway, and felt her stomach drop as she saw that the tiny door was no longer in the corner. It had shifted positions again, now centered perfectly on the wall across from her bed. She stepped inside slowly, dread crashing over her as she approached the new position of the small door, feeling the air grow heavier and colder with each moment. She stared at the impossible opening. She kneeled down, her breathing unsteady, and reached out reluctantly, needing to test the knob again, needing to confirm whether the connection to the corridor remained alive. She touched the warm brass knob, and her heart froze as she felt a faint tapping from the other side. 3 slow, deliberate taps, evenly spaced, as if something inside was knocking back. She jerked away, scrambling across the floor, her eyes wide with terror as the tapping continued, louder each time, until the entire frame shuddered with the force of the final knock. She collapsed against her bed, trembling violently, tears streaming down her face as she whispered to herself the truth she had been avoiding since the moment she first saw the tiny door. It hadn't appeared in her room By accident, it had been looking for her.